In one video, I discussed this tactic that's often used against Christians and other theists when they attempt to present reasons for the beliefs they hold dear. It's a tactic wherein the opponent will pick apart every nuance, every ambiguity, every shade of definition, as though this somehow constituted a logical rebuttal. I refer to this as deconstructionism. What do I mean? Well, for example, if you attempt to refute the notion that there is no absolute truth, you should not be surprised if someone pipes up and says, "Wait a minute, you haven't defined what truth is." Give me a break. Or if you discuss whether there's such a thing as absolute morality, don't be surprised if someone says, "Wait a minute, you need to define what morality is." And so forth and so on. Most recently, I was revisiting the issue of whether Christianity and or religion are the greatest causes of suffering and death in the world. Predictably, one person piped up by saying, "You need to define what suffering is. You haven't defined suffering." Give me a break. I remember one discussion wherein I pointed out that someone's beliefs were illogical. Interestingly enough, this person said, "You need to define what logic is. Define logic." Now, do you see why this gets to be absurd? It's not as though there is some difficulty in understanding what truth and morality and suffering and logic are. These are well-established terms that even school children know. Not for one moment do I believe that people are asking these questions because they perceive some real ambiguity here. I think it would be naive to think that. Rather, it's a way of aggressively arguing, in fact by offering a never-ending stream of demands for definitions, without actually addressing the logic of the other person's position. Now, I'm not going to recap the entire video. There's just no point in doing that. If you want to, you can always revisit it and rewatch it. I would like to talk about two observations that I was not able to cover in the previous video, though. The first observation is that it's not enough merely to assert that there's some ambiguity in the definition. For the sake of argument, let's say that there is some ambiguity in the definition of terms like truth or love or morality or reality or whatever. It's not enough to assert that there is, or even to prove that there's some ambiguity. You need to demonstrate that this ambiguity is somehow relevant to the discussion at hand. For example, biologists will disagree on what the exact definition of life is, even though that's their field of study. For example, they may disagree about whether viruses are really alive or not. In fact, some textbooks will make that point of contention very clear, and they'll very clearly emphasize that this is a gray area that will be debated. Yet this does not prevent biologists from discussing the issue of life in general, or the complexity of life, or the viability of life, and so forth and so on. Why? Because this ambiguity is simply not relevant to the topic at hand. Similarly, if you're going to assert that there's some ambiguity in the definition of truth, which nobody's been able to demonstrate as far as I'm concerned, it's not enough merely to assert or even prove that. You need to show how this is somehow relevant to the topic at hand. In a previous video, I talked about how the claim that there is no absolute truth is self-refuting. That's a pretty strong argument right there. Now, I don't see how any ambiguity in that statement any ambiguity in that definition would somehow disprove that proof. The second observation I'd like to make is that people will demand definitions or aggressively demand definitions of one side but not the other. For example, it's not uncommon for skeptics to assert that there's no absolute truth. But when was the last time you heard a skeptic demand of another skeptic that they define truth? See what I mean? If someone is genuinely interested in the truth, and if someone genuinely believes that ambiguities in these definitions are somehow relevant to the topic at hand, they would be demanding definitions of both sides. Yet I've never seen that happen. Invariably, it occurs, at least in my experience, you have the skeptics demanding these definitions of very fundamental terms of Christians and other theists, but never demanding it of fellow skeptics. I'm not saying it never happens the other way, but I've never seen it happen that way. And anecdotal evidence from other believers suggests that they experience the same thing. Or for example, in a series of discussions, you've had people assert that religion is the #1 cause of suffering in the world. Apparently, you can get away with saying that. But if you try to refute that notion, you're going to get bombarded with demands that you define what suffering is. Richard Dawkins has lamented the tremendous amounts of suffering and evil that religion has supposedly caused. Why do you not have skeptics asking him to demand what suffering and evil are? See what I mean? If you are genuinely interested in the truth, if you genuinely believe that this is a valid objection, you would raise that objection or level that challenge to both sides. This is why I don't believe for one moment that when people raise these issues, it's because of some genuine logical flaw that they perceive. No, it's a way of offering the semblance of a response, the semblance of a rebuttal, without actually rebutting anything. By the way, this notion of using a double standard, of applying a double standard, demanding one standard for believers but an entirely different standard of non-believers, is very common. One of these days, I'd like to publish a video on that. One last thing, I can already predict how some people are going to respond. Some will respond by saying, wait a minute, you're the ones who are claiming that there's such a thing as absolute truth, or morality, or reality, or logic, and so forth and so on. We're not making any such claim. We don't have to defend anything. We don't have to defend any definitions. I think that's a specious argument, and I think we all recognize that. Why? Because if you're saying there is no such thing as absolute truth or morality, then you're making a claim. And as such, it behooves you to substantiate that claim. The burden of proof, or at the very least the burden of evidence, rests on your shoulders. If you're going to demand definitions of the other side, you need to be able to provide definitions for your position as well. I think that's just common sense. It's a refusal to adopt a double standard, and it's exactly how intelligent adults should be approaching these issues. By the way, if there are Christians out there that apply a double standards manner, then I disprove that as well. I think I've been quite clear about that. In my experience though, by and large, it occurs the other way around. When one side has their back against the wall, and when they feel the need to offer some sort of aggressive response.